We was going to make a movie what was going to make us famous and rich, and the movie is about a Sasquatch, what is like a big ape, what is good at hiding and hard to catch. It's got other names as well. What it's called a skunk ape because it stinks, and a Bigfoot because it's got feet bigger than a clown, and Dad said what it is called a money monkey as well, because if anyone gets a picture of it they can sell it for loads of money, and that's what we will do. But Mum said what we don't know nothing about Sasquatches, and we got to find somebody who knows what they are on about. This sets Granny off thinking, and she gets on the computer and hits at it. Then after a bit she cackles, spits at the ceiling and scratches her bum with her hook. Grandad looks at the computer and says what Granny has found someone, and he lives in a desert in America, and he knows everything about Sasquatches, and he is called Desert Sasquatch. What I say is a stupid name because he isn't a Sasquatch, but Grandad says what it's like a name you get when you know everything about something, but Mum says like what, and Grandad says like Peter the Great, but Mum says that's different, and I want to be called the Great. And so do you, but I say you can't have two greats, and we fight. And Dad tells us to shut up, and Grandad says what the Desert Sasquatch proper name is Brett, and what Sasquatches write letters to him, and he writes letters to Sasquatches, so he knows all about them. And he lives in a desert, so he's called Desert Sasquatch. Mum says what if Sasquatches are bloomin' great monkeys, how can they write? But Grandad says what they are clever monkeys. And Aunt Myrtle says she had a hamster what was clever once. When it walked over spilt paint it made squiggly lines what looked a bit like letters what you could read, and if you grabbed it and shoved it around a bit in the paint it could make pictures as well. Granny started gibbering and rolling her eyes and swaying backwards and forwards and hammering her hook on the table. Grandad says what Granny says we got to go to America and see the Desert Sasquatch what is really called Brett, and we got to ask him to find a real Sasquatch so we can take pictures of it and make a movie and get rich and famous. And Mum says what she is going to star in the movie, and you and me and Dad and Grandad have got to behave right proper in America, and what we have got to stay clean and say please and thank you and be polite and don't touch nothing or else. How we got to America were a whole bloomin' story what you couldn't make up. There were a rumpus and we was arrested, and then Granny did the thing that she does when she gets angry, and we got away, and we got to the airport and there were another rumpus because Mum caught Dad trying to change his ticket, so what, when he were on the plane he was sitting beside a woman who were right pretty. And then there was another rumpus because Aunt Myrtle looked at the passengers what were sitting in the waiting room and said what their postures were bad, and that's because they were scared of flying, and what they needed to sit properly and be brave, and what she can help them if they join in with a chant. And she starts chanting, and Aunt Myrtle's chants are normally sort of boring song things on one note, what they sing in a country called Tibet, what goes on and on until you're so bored you fall asleep. But because we are going to America, Aunt Myrtle chooses an American chant what Red Indians sing when there's a war and they're all getting revved up, and it starts with a long scream what would scare a bloomin' lion. Then it goes off into gibberish what's shouted and makes you want to fight something and beat it up, and everybody does sit up, but then men in uniforms take Aunt Myrtle away, but what they bring her back later, and she says what they searched her all over and it were fun, and she wants to be searched again, and Dad says where's the bar, but Mum says what he can't drink nothing. But she notices what Uncle Ted is looking guilty, and she checks his wooden leg and he's got a bottle of whiskey hidden inside it, and Mum goes bonkers. But just then an American woman says what she likes Mum's hairdo, and Mum looks right pleased, and they get to chatting, and Aunt Myrtle and Granny join in, and Dad and Uncle Ted and Grandad get talking to some American men who want to know about English football, and that sets them off right proper because Dad reckons he knows everything about football, and so does Uncle Ted and Grandad, and you can't shut them up. And then some American kids come over and their mums let them play with us, what's not fair, because our mum wouldn't let us play with them if we wanted to. What American mums are better than English mums in that way, and the kids were good, and we did get into trouble, but that were because the American kids wanted to show us how to play American football, what is different from English football, and we used a woman's handbag as a ball and we knocked things over and got shouted at. But it were fun, and we didn't burn anything down or out like that, and when we got on the plane we stayed all together and was kept under control by a woman in a uniform what was like a waitress and a woman policeman both together, and we didn't dare give her no bother. We get to America and Granny gets a car and we drive for ages, and it's mad because we are in America and everybody drives on the wrong side of the road, and Dad keeps forgetting and driving on the right side, what makes everybody swerve around and honk their horns and swear, and Mum shouts too, and it's scary. We drive all the way to the desert where Brett lives, except what it's not a proper desert, because what it's in America and hasn't got sand and camels, it's just got trees, except what even they're not proper trees, they're scrawny and little. Grandad says what the trees are rubbish because they are thirsty, because what it is a desert and there's no water and it's got snakes. Mum says she don't want to see no snakes, but Grandad says what there's loads of deer as well, and they all look like Bambi and they're cute. Mum says that's all right then, and you want to see a deer because what you had seen Bambi on the telly, and I remind you what Bambi had been shot, and you cried, and you did remember, and you cried again, and Mum told me to shut up, what that was just a movie, real Bambis don't get shot. Then there's a big house right in front of us, and it's right big and posh, and Mum shouts at Dad to stop because we were at where we was going, and Dad looks at Mum and says that he knows where we bloomin' well is, and obviously he's going to stop or he'll hit the house. But just as he said this, he drove straight into a bloomin' great ditch what was just in front of the house, and the car tilts over and we all fall forward and shout. When we get out and climb out of the ditch, Mum makes us all shut up shouting, and we have to brush off the mud and comb our hair and straighten our clothes and do up our laces and try and look decent for a change. And she says what we've got to behave and be quiet and be polite and don't scratch. Then Mum inspected us and said we was ready. We go up to the door of the house and Mum knocks, and the lady opens the door, and she's right pretty. And Mum says what we have come to see a man called Brett. The lady says what she was expecting us, but what Brett isn't here, but to come in anyway, and she goes back in, and Mum goes in, and Dad is about to go in, and we was going to follow Dad, but Mum turns around and tells Dad and us to stay outside, what weren't fair, because there were a smell of things like roast potato and gravy and apple pie coming out of the door, and we wanted some. Mum was ages, and we got bored, and Dad says what we should get the car out of the ditch, but Aunt Myrtle says what we will get muddy and Mum will go bonkers, so we can't. But just then there's the noise of a big engine, and a bloomin' great bulldozer goes over and reaches down with its spade and oinks the car up out of the ditch and puts it back on the road, and don't even scratch it or bend it, and that were right clever. Then the bulldozer turns around and starts digging the ditch, and it does it quick and proper, and Grandad says what the driver is right good. Then the bulldozer digs up a pile of muck and turns around to drop it, and we can see what the driver is a kid. I never seen a kid doing that, and it weren't fair, cause Mum and Dad wouldn't let us drive a bulldozer, and that's because they aren't American. But I want to be American and drive a bloomin' great digger, and I tell Dad what I want to be an American kid now, and drive a bulldozer and dig stuff. And you say you want to be an American too, but Dad says shut up. And just then the door opens, and the lady looks out and says to come in and have something to eat. What we did, and what we could smell food, and there was a table full of food what looked better than in a calf, and we wanted it. But Mum made us be polite first and introduce ourselves. And the lady were right nice, and her voice was like off the cowboy movies what Mum and Dad watches on the telly on Sunday afternoon, when the lady in charge of everything cooks fantastic grub and got chickens and kids and rides horses and shoots baddies, but can dress up proper sometimes, and that's when the music gets soppy, and that's when she looks bloomin' beautiful, and Mum cries and Dad cries as well, but always says what he doesn't. But what we don't care, because we are starving and Granny is starting to drool and wave her hook around, what isn't a good sign. But then the lady tells us to sit down, and we want to grab at everything. But Mum says what we have to say grace first, like we always do before a meal, and say thank you for the meal. We don't know what she is on about, but she says like we always do, so we better go along with whatever it is. Dad says he will say grace because he is head of the family, and Mum looks at us like not to laugh or there would be trouble, and she looks at Dad like there was going to be trouble. And Dad says thank you to the lady because the meal looks bloomin' great, and if she hadn't made it we wouldn't have it, so it's bloomin' brilliant. Mum looks like she's right cross, but she won't say what about. But we're starving, and we reckon Dad's grace were a good grace, and we clap, and we dive into the grub. I don't know what nothing was called except the gravy, what is gravy, but everything was fantastic, even the green leafy things. It were even better than pizza, and the meat was better than fried chicken, and you wanted to know what meat it was, but before the lady could say what it were, and you weren't looking, Mum puts her fingers up by her head like she were a cow. And the lady looks like she understands and says what the meat is called beef, and then Mum starts talking about something else, but I guess what the meat isn't beef, it's a Bambi, and I'm going to tell you, but Mum guesses what I have guessed, and looks at me not to say nothing or else. Then there was a pie afterwards, what was so good like we never had nothing like it ever. It were real food, Mum said, what didn't come from a can, and what had been cooked proper. And we couldn't stop eating until we was too stuffed to stuff any more in, and there was more if we wanted it. It were incredible. We are too full to move, and falling asleep when Granny belches and gnashes her dentures and waves her hook up and down. Grandad says what she's saying and what we got to do the washing up to say thanks. You and me want to do the washing up because it's soapy and hot and you can get bubbles going all over the place, although everything does get wet and Mum goes bonkers, and Mum's not going to let that happen here because this house is a proper house what don't get wet and messy, and we have to say thank you to the lady and get out and stay out and get some fresh air and exercise and don't get in anybody's way and don't touch anything and don't go nowhere or do nothing. After a bit, Dad and Grandad come out and say what would they have done the washing up, then they got kicked out like us. We are all knackered after eating so much, so we go back to the car for a kip. It's nice falling asleep in the car, but someone knocks on the window and it's Mum and the lady what cooked, and she says that Brett has come back. Dad and Grandad go to meet Brett, but Mum tells you and me to stay in the car because we will be going soon. After they was all gone, we can't sleep because we get bored and fight, but I nearly fall on the thing what makes the horn go beep, and if the horn had gone off, Mum would go bonkers. Then you see what the key is in the lock, what you turn to make the engine go, and you want to turn it, and I want to turn it, but what we know we can't. Except what I remember what you have to push down a pedal when you turn the key. So, we can turn the key, and the engine won't start, so I do turn the key. And it was like I said, it made a noise like tin was being crunched, and that were all. The engine didn't start. Then I pushed a pedal to feel what it felt like, but just then you turned the key, and the engine started, and the car jumped forward like it were a jet plane. And we tore toward the house, shouting and yanking at the steering wheel, but you pulled one way and I pulled the other way, and we went straight, and was going to hit the front door head on. But just then the door opened and Granny came out to fart and scratch and spit what she couldn't do in the house, and she sees us roaring towards her and jumps up on the bonnet. Then she reaches over and grabs the door and opens the door and reaches in and grabs the steering wheel with a hook, and she hoiks it around and kicks down at the handbrake and some pedals, and what we spin around like crazy. Granny spins the car a few more times and stops it back where we started, and she's cackling and waving a hook around because she's having fun and reckons kids should be kids. Then she jumps out of the car and gets back into the house, and nobody will know what we've done. Granny is the best granny in the world, and because of that we don't do nothing bad for ages. But that was just the start, because Granny had been thinking, and when Granny gets to thinking, you know things are going to be crazy whatever you bloomin' do.